be supporting it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members, we move to 5-minute calls. The Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, I suppose the most notable thing of that speech was he says the currency's a little bit overvalued. A little bit overvalued. This country last year had the worst current account deficit in the developed world, according to the IMF. And this year, and for the next 3 years to the end of the projection period, the worst in the developed world, according to the IMF. According to the OECD, second worst in the world because they include Turkey. They include Turkey. Mr. Goldsmith, the problem with some historians is that they can never look forward. They can only ever look back. And that speech was such an edited view of the past. He pretended that the Right Honourable Winston Peters bill took us back to the 1970s, when we didn't have an independent reserve bank, when we didn't have a floating currency. Mr. Peters' bill leaves us with an independent reserve bank, leaves us with a floating currency, but tries to address this fundamental hollowing out of the New Zealand economy caused by our prolonged current account deficit, a contributor to which is our overvalued currency. Now, we are supporting this bill. We are supporting this bill. After 25 years of the current Reserve Bank Act, it's time to have a look at it again. There are some wording changes I would make. I would prefer to look at an external balance objective rather than an exchange rate objective. But we should be talking about this. Last year, I did a study tour of various notables on monetary policy because I believe that Winston Peters is right that we've got a problem. I saw, amongst other people, Jeffrey Frankel at Harvard University. He said two things that stuck in my mind. He said, firstly, no one system of monetary policy is right for every country in the world. There's no universal principle here. And secondly, he said, no one system of monetary policy is right for any one country all of the time. After 25 years of this current iteration of monetary policy, it is time to look at it again. It is not sacrosanct. It is not writ by Moses on some ancient stone tablet, as Mr. Goldsmith would have us believe. It is an area of policy that government should take responsibility for. This government, he says that under the old days we used to have house price inflation. Well, actually, we did have house price inflation that ran at roughly the same rate as general inflation. Now we've got house price inflation that runs way ahead of general inflation, and we've got unaffordable house prices in Auckland to such an extent that the Reserve Bank is worried about the financial stability of the financial sector, and the government's effectively delegated housing policy to the Reserve Bank. After the abject failure of their own policy, the Reserve Bank's been forced into a corner and has introduced loan-to-valuation ratios that hurt most first home buyers. And we in Labor say that is an indication of how poor this government's policy is. There is no doubt that New Zealand needs to broaden our export base. We need to get the investment going into the right place through a capital gains tax. We need to increase the depth of our capital markets by having a universal KiwiSaver scheme so that we've got more capital to invest in our own businesses. But we also need to look at whether we are hobbling our exporters and our import substitutors by inappropriate monetary policy which drives the exchange rate and holds the exchange rate higher than it should be. Who warned New Zealand that under current monetary policy we would end up with structurally higher interest rates than the rest of the world? No one. But we have. We've got higher interest rates, which means that when a New Zealand company hits a bump, it's more economic for an overseas buyer to buy that company than a New Zealand company. Mr. Speaker, we should be looking at this issue. It's an important issue, and I'm surprised that the National Party is so narrow-minded, so defensive, that despite a decrease in exports outside of the primary sector, they will not consider helping our export sector by introducing a broader objective for the Reserve Bank and more tools. It does need more tools. It's not giving up on the inflation objective, but it needs to do more than just say we can only look at inflation, not the exchange rate, and then the government says we can do nothing about the exchange rate, it's all delegated to the Reserve Bank, and no one takes responsibility for the developed world's largest current account deficit, and the rising debt and foreign ownership that accrues from it.
The question is some member going to seek the call? Maggie.